Please pray with me, Spirit of wisdom, of encouragement, of compassion. Minister to us, your people, we pray. May only truth be spoken, may only truth be heard. Amen. There's an old song some of you will know called "Breaking Up is Hard to Do." And I was thinking that making up is hard to do sometimes, but it's well worth it. To be a human in any healthy sense of the word is to live within a web of interconnected relationships. And since we're all different with differing tastes and points of view and styles and backgrounds and understanding of language, the challenge to communicate and to negotiate is as important to our spiritual health as our diet is to our physical health. Negotiations are part of life. When we buy a car or a house, there's a price, and then we negotiate the terms. The desire for a raise at work usually requires negotiation. We return a defective appliance and we don't have the receipt. Negotiation. We're always negotiating, even when we're unaware of it. Honey, who's picking up the kids from school today? Shall we eat in or out tonight? What time should the kids be in bed? How much should their allowance be? What do they got to do in return for it? How much will we give the church this year? Not that the word negotiation is a term we often apply to our lives, but it's an important part of life because we're so interconnected. And because of that, conflicts can happen at any time, anywhere, with anyone. Misunderstandings are common. I'm reminded of a story of a woman who was wanting to get up in the bus. But as she went to step up in that first step, her skirt was so tight that she really couldn't get her leg up high enough. And so she just kind of casually went and just zipped her skirt down just a little bit to be able to put her leg up, but she still couldn't, and so she tried again and again. And there was this big Texan standing behind her, and he saw her struggle, and he just kind of gently picked her up and put her on the first step. And she was furious. And she just turned around and says, "How dare you touch me like that? I don't even know you." And he says, "Well, normally I'd agree with you, ma'am, but since you unzipped my fly 3 times, I kind of thought we were friends." You see, what we don't know is really often more than we do know. And I heard a preacher say the other day, the prophet, God was speaking through the prophet, and he says we're to walk humbly before our God. And I think one of the best definitions I've heard of humbly means sometimes I'm wrong. Sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes we're wrong, right? Let's just be aware of that. And so making up can be hard to do, but it's worth it in the end. Now, today I'm not talking about conflict between today I'm talking about conflict between good people and loving families. There's no making up with people who are hateful, people who always see themselves as victims, people who are mean. You just kind of got to protect yourself from that. But I'm talking today about people like us, people committed to kindness and respect and fairness. And when our relationships break down, they're worth working to maintain. We wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for those early followers of the way working through the conflict that we read about today. That's what our scripture story is all about. Like, just imagine the first 10 years after Jesus' death, the disciples and followers of Jesus had fled to their homes, fearful, devastated. Peter went back to fishing. Their lives were in shambles. But something remarkable began to happen. People began to understand what Jesus was saying. They began to feel his spirit with them. They began to come together, and they began to realize that it's all about this love, that the laws that the politicians and the religious people and other people make, they're fine as long as they're not incongruent with love. And so they began to realize they were free from a corrupt temple system. They were free from having to go buy outrageously priced lambs for sacrifice. They were free from being under the thumb of the priests. Jesus connected them to God. They felt free. And the people began to talk to one another about their experiences. And they began to feel this common sense of connection with a God that says kindness is enough, that love is all we need. And the disciples, who began to be called apostles, started having these house meetings. And Peter had this mystical rooftop experience. These people were all Jewish, right? Jesus was a Jew. And Peter had this mystical experience, and it was of all these unclean foods coming down, the foods that the Jews are not allowed to eat. And the Spirit said to Peter, eat some of these food. And it just turned his stomach. And he says, no, I've never done that. And then what he heard God say to him was, listen, Peter, anything I've created, anything that's good is for me. And what Peter got was that God was preparing him to accept into the assembly, into the gatherings, into their homes, Gentiles, pagans, who weren't going to follow the kosher laws, who weren't going to get circumcised. But you can see that if circumcision and those laws were so essential to your identity, and you started having a whole bunch of other people come in that didn't follow those, they just wanted to follow this love thing, that it was going to create conflict. I mean, it's kind of like us saying we don't care if you're an atheist. We just care if you share our values of kindness, respect, and fairness. I mean, that would drive a lot of churches crazy, right? And so there began to be some conflict. And so what Peter and the disciples did, and Paul, they called a leadership meeting, a leadership council to deal with this. And at the end of the council, we heard what James said. You know, they heard the debate. No, we've got to have circumcision. That's the basis of our faith. That's the basis of the covenant that God has made with Abraham, right? And you could hear the different arguments. And, you know, Paul the apostle, a lot of people didn't like Paul because Paul never knew Jesus. And all the apostles had known Jesus. And Paul had been a persecutor of the Christians. He'd killed Christians. I mean, can you imagine accepting somebody like that? But he had this total change about. And he had a mystical experience of Jesus. And so some of the people there were saying, well, we shouldn't even listen to this guy. He's not a real apostle, right? And yet people were coming into the church. And Peter had baptized an Ethiopian official in the court in Africa, in Ethiopia. And the whole church movement just sprung up in Africa. That was the first big move of thousands of people becoming Christians, was in Africa. And then with Paul, it began to spread to the West. And so at the end of the gathering, we heard the message that we will not trouble the Gentiles coming into our assembly with the laws that are particular to the Jews. We will focus on this central message that love is enough. And so that movement began and just spread all around the world. They negotiated and they shared their point of view. And James says, I have reached the decision we should not trouble these Gentiles who are turning to God. Circumcision was to be respected, but it was optional. It was a decision for inclusivity, a radical decision which invited us Gentiles to be welcome at their Jewish table. And then the table became beyond Jew or Gentile. Now, some couldn't accept the decision. There's always going to be some who are so feeling of hurt and anger and displaced that they can't get on board. But the majority did. The leadership council was respected. And so that's the way forward, is through negotiation. Now there's a slide, see if we can see it here, that I have found very helpful in my life. And it basically shows the different options we have when we're in conflict. So it starts at the top, gather, dating, sharing, and clarifying. So that's when you get to know one another. You get to know each other, gathering data. You get to see what you can expect, what is this person like and not like, and what can we do together that's fun and that sort of thing. And so we begin to get role clarity, and we begin to be committed to one another, whether it's in families or friends or work or whatever. And so we move into a period of stability and productivity and confidence, and everything's going great. But inevitably, in all our relationships, there's going to be a pinch. And usually the pinch is not a big deal. And so you just kind of move back up. Oh, okay, so they're sensitive about that, so I'm just going to say sorry and not raise that again. You know what I mean? It's not a big, hard thing to work through. And you can just work it through and then move into, again, more stability and confidence. But then sometimes something happens in a family, with friends, at work, in a church, where there's a crunch, where somebody feels so hurt, that they feel betrayed. And so then when that happens, it's really complicated and difficult. Because when you're in a crunch, you're in high anxiety, you feel resentment, you blame, you feel guilt, you feel all kinds of tough things. So one of the things that often happens is called the resentful termination. We just say, I'm out of there, right? And so somebody who's been in a church for a long time will just disappear. And, you say, wow, where'd they go? And you can't work it through. Or someone will just quit their job without dealing with the issue. Or in a family, people who've gotten along for years just not speak to each other, right? So that's the resentful or the premature termination. Then there's the stalemate, where you just kind of suck it up and you just kind of live with a bitterness, but you're not engaged anymore. You're not joyful anymore. It's just putting up with it, and that's no good. And then the other thing is, in that state too, that's where you tend to become passive-aggressive. Outwardly, everything's fine, but then you're telling your friends how awful somebody is and how awful that is, and your life becomes consumed with negative energy. But what we're called to do is do that reconciliation. Yes, we're under duress. Yes, we're stressed, but we've got to go back and negotiate. We've got to negotiate, and we've got to go to the person that we have our issue with. And we can be so helpful with others. If somebody comes and complains about somebody to us, what we need to do is encourage them to say, hey, look, talk to that person. Talking to me isn't going to solve your problem. And I've been blessed by people in my life when I'd go and complain about something or somebody, they'd say to me, Paul, there's 3 sides to every story. There's your side, there's the other person's side, and then there's the truth. So you need to negotiate to find that middle ground. And, it wasn't I always like it when I complain about someone. I say, oh, yes, that's awful. Oh, Paul, that's terrible, right? Oh, that feels good, right? But doesn't solve my problem. And so I've appreciated those people who've challenged me to do that. And so then, often, with good negotiation, sometimes, like if you're in a family or a marriage or something, you might have to get a therapist to help you negotiate, right? In a church, we've got a ministry and personnel committee that the minister's not a member of, so that they can deal with personnel issues and things in the congregation with everybody on a level playing field and help negotiate and mediate. And so sometimes we do need those helps, but we've got to deal with the people that we've got the issues with, or the organization, or in a family, the mediation. And so it's so important. And then, of course, sometimes after that, then you say, well, it's time for me to move on. But that's a termination after reconciliation. That's a wise termination. It's not that just, God, I'm leaving, where you lose everything you've invested in. It's a mature saying, well, no, okay, we've kind of worked things through, but need to move on to something else. So just a little chart that I found helpful. And it's so important to realize this need to negotiate and to help one another. It happens in every profession. But when I'm with ministers, often they'll start complaining about some other minister. And in the early years, I might have joined in or just been silent. But now I say, look, stop this. Right? You don't know what's going on in that minister's life. And they're doing some good work. Like, if you got a big issue with them, talk to them. It doesn't make me popular at that particular group at that time, but that's what we need to do with one another, right? We got to encourage one another to work things through. So I'm very excited that next week my brother's coming to visit. I haven't seen him for like 5 years because there's been 2 years of pandemics. The year before that we went to Italy, so we haven't been down east, right? And I try to see him every time I go back. And my brother was like my hero when I was a kid. He was 10 years older than me. He was so cool. He was so nice and personable, and he was good to me. He let me know that there was life beyond my crazy family. And he was just really kind. And in fact, I wouldn't play the way I can play today without him. Because I took classical music, I didn't like it. I would never have played the piano again. But he had a girlfriend singing in a Pentecostal singing group. And the tenor in the group, who was the piano player, he didn't want to have to play and sing. And so my brother said, well, try my brother out, Perry said, try Paul out and see if you can teach him to play by ear. And so the tenor player taught me how to play by ear. And then I started playing for that quartet. And I discovered I could play by ear, and I just spent hours listening to quartet music, and I could figure out what the piano was doing. Right, that's my brother. But in my 20s, we got into business together. And he did something that just devastated me. I just felt so hurt and betrayed. And then I did something that he felt hurt and betrayed, right? And for 20 years, we didn't talk. 20 years. And it didn't feel good. But we were each right? But we were very blessed because our mutual friends refused to side with either one of us. They kept saying, you guys got to work this out. This is crazy. And his oldest daughter, who's a remarkable person, she was just elected as a city councilor in Halifax. First time running, beating an incumbent. But she's just a person of joy and warmth and love. She kept working on her dad. Dad, you got to talk to Paul. And she'd come visit us in Ontario because she's got relatives in Sarnia. And she'd go back and tell her dad all about my life, right? And it was at my father's funeral that she got my brother and I to come together. And work through our stuff. And it's been such a joy. And when you do work through the stuff, then your relationship even deepens and it strengthens. And so as Christians, that's what we're called to do. To talk to who needs to be talked about, to negotiate, to realize that underneath this particular thing, we do have so much connection and goodwill because that's the kind of people we are. And so we give thanks to what Spirit can do when we're willing to do the work to make up. Thanks be to God.